Hello, my name is Nina. Welcome to my channel, Inside the Mind of a Human Predator. In this video, I would like to try to condense a very complex novel, Dostoyevsky's late 19th century Crime and Punishment, into a brief format for the purpose of analyzing the personality type of arguably one of the best known literary murderers in the history of literature. I am referring, obviously, to Rodion Raskolnikov. When we differentiate between writers and authors, it is authors that surpass cultural and temporal constraints and make their works universally relatable and universally accessible. This is England's Shakespeare, and this is Russia's Dostoyevsky. So, one of the key reasons why these works of literature are accessible on such a wide scale is the fact that the psychology of the characters is both believable and relatable. Sometimes we can even think of someone we've encountered in our daily life that reminds us of these characters. Dostoyevsky, specifically, has often been described as a masterful psychologist. Even Sigmund Freud penned an article called Dostoyevsky and Parasite, which he contributed to a 1920s collection on another Dostoyevsky novel, The Brothers Karamazov. So this was broadly acknowledged even in professional circles. So what I'd like to do is have a brief look at the background, the novel itself, and then a bit of a more of a detailed look at the personality type and any potential personality pathologies when it comes to the main protagonist, a recluse, an intellectual, a former university student who was quite impoverished, and of course, a well-known fictional axe murderer, Raskolnikov. The novel takes place in the latter part of the 19th century in the beautiful but often dreary city of St. Petersburg, which is located in the north of the country. This is a time of change in Russia. Most important, the age-old institution of serfdom was abolished in 1861, which is an interesting parallel to the abolition of slavery in the United States. Multiple debates are taking place about the country's future, direction, development. These debates are, generally speaking, between more socially conservative-minded intellectuals, thinkers, politicians, and progressives, between the more patriotically, nationalistically minded Slavophiles and the so-called Westernizers, etc. There was even an unsuccessful assassination attempt on the life of the Tsar in 1866, which is the same year when this novel was initially published. One of the key places where these debates are taking place is the university setting. And of course, Raskolnikov himself is a former university student. Sometimes very radical ideas are brought up in the setting. Dostoevsky's own disdain for radicalism and nihilism later in life is often linked and mentioned in the context of this particular novel. So this social milieu, this very general social milieu, is a backdrop for crime and punishment. So injustice and social inequality often comes up in the novel. For instance, the case of certain women who are forced into selling their bodies for the sake of financially supporting their families is brought up. At the same time, the novel focuses on questions of morality as they are linked to human psychology. In fact, when it comes to psychology, there is even a little bit of dream analysis. Raskolnikov has a dream about a horse which is being viciously beaten, and that appears to be a parallel to the way that the lower classes, the impoverished, are abused within this particular social system. So, to roughly summarize this very complex novel, Raskolnikov is a highly intelligent, very impoverished former university student. He has a very reclusive lifestyle and a general inability to connect not just with individual people in his life, friends and family, but society at large. He murders an old woman who is a pawnbroker. He also murders her sister, who is basically a witness to the initial murder. Now, his immediate reasons appear to be financially motivated, but he even fails to steal anything of value from the pawnbroker so as to change his station in life to any significant extent. But more important, he has a number of so-called philosophic justifications at which he arrived himself. One of them is that the woman is engaging in usury, which is a moral failure. He also seeks to use this murder to surpass the common man and reach the realm of the greats, such as Napoleon, to whom everything is permissible, in Raskolnikov's view, obviously. Eventually, he ends up confessing to the murder. He is sentenced to a prison sentence in Siberia, where he is sent, and eventually he picks up the Bible as he's serving his sentence there, and he begins to take Orthodox Christianity seriously to ultimately be fully transformed for the better. Now, let's have a look at the clues that Dostoyevsky left for us regarding Raskolnikov's personality type, and any possible pathologies. The first and most obvious clue is Raskolnikov's lifestyle of extreme isolation. He lives almost like a hermit. He has no friends, and he is unable to connect to society at large, not just individuals. On its own, this trait seems to surpass mere introversion. However, it can mean a variety of things without looking at anything else. This could be extreme social anxiety. This could be something more serious, like traits associated with type A personality disorders, such as the schizotypal personality disorder. However, Dostoyevsky takes this much further. He talks about Raskolnikov developing his own ideas about the world, but these ideas are basically linked to intellectual theorizing. They're not really based on empirical evidence and through social engagement and interaction, because his character is such a recluse. So he's using his intellectual prowess, but the lack of social engagement is very evident. And so Raskolnikov arrives at his view of society at large, and he's convinced that he is absolutely right. So here we get the first major glimpse of his sense of grandiosity and superiority. This grandiosity is further explored in detail in an article called On Crime that Raskolnikov publishes in the fictional newspaper in this novel. In this article, he lays out his theory about two types of people: the inferior majority, which, for the lack of a better word, are basically breeders. They require a strict moral and legal code, according to Raskolnikov, and the superior minority. Now, these latter specimens are fundamentally different. They have the ability to transform, at times through destruction, current society for the better. They're not bound by social norms. They're not bound by legal norms. They're even allowed to spill blood. So anything goes for the greats. Indeed, these greats, these Supermen, again, for the lack of a better word, have the right to transgress whatever they want to transgress. Morality, social rules, legal framework, etc. It's hard not to think of Nietzsche's view of morality as it was analyzed in Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, which of course were published a couple of decades later, but it's pretty relevant. Unsurprisingly, guess which group Raskolnikov associates himself with? The lower people, which he essentially compares to cattle. He calls them trembling beasts, trembling creatures, or the supermen, these greats. Well, of course, he's not associating himself with the breeders, again, for the lack of a better word. He thinks of himself as one of the superior specimens. Again, hidden grandiosity, very obvious in this article. As a man who is above society's rules, he is allowed to commit a crime and thus definitively prove to himself that he is great. He feels entitled to murder this old woman as a test of his own greatness for himself. He seeks to control the entire anthill, Dostoyevsky's quote, comprised of the gray biomass, my quote. He says, quote, "Would I be able to step over this boundary or not? Would I dare to take what's mine or not? Am I a trembling beast, or do I have the right to do what I want?" He reasons, end quote. So you can see the extent to which his article is revealing. It is pretty clear to me, in my opinion, that his lack of friendship, his detachment from society are not simply the result of social anxiety, being very introverted, but rather more so a concealed sense of grandiosity and the belief in one's own superiority. This type of thinking, in conjunction with other traits, obviously, may be associated with covert narcissism. Furthermore, cleansing society of undesirables like those engaging in morally questionable practices like usury, in Raskolnikov's view, is permissible, once again in his view, for those who are superior human specimens. So you could see how this type of reasoning, which we've seen in TV characters like serial killer Dexter, is also reminiscent of real serial killers who believed strongly that they were ameliorating society by getting rid of these undesirables. Essentially, this is Raskolnikov's view. Of course, his disregard for the right and wrong goes beyond core narcissism. It is antisocial in the criminal sense. Next, Dostoyevsky gives many of the characters in this novel symbolic names. I won't go through them for the sake of brevity, but the name Raskolnikov signifies a split, a schism of some kind. To a Russian speaker, the word Raskol is very obvious. It could refer to a number of issues. It could refer to a religious schism in Orthodoxy. Of course, Dostoyevsky, as was mentioned before, was very interested in Orthodoxy and its history in Russia. However, it can also refer to a split personality. So let's look at the way in which Raskolnikov's personality was split. On the one hand, he was asocial, antisocial, callous, hostile, completely unempathetic, usually. On the other hand, he appeared to be capable of significant displays of empathy. For instance, there was a case where his acquaintance, Semyon Marmeladov, was crushed by a vehicle in the street. Eventually he died, and Raskolnikov attempted to help him by using what little financial resources he had for this awful, awful accident. And the question is, was this genuine empathy, or was this grand display meant for attention seeking? Furthermore, his personality is split between grandiosity and self-loathing. Well, we've looked at grandiosity just now. At first, he believes himself to be part of the supermen, of the superior few, who are allowed to transgress morality, who are allowed to transgress legality. However, later on, he reframes the murders that he committed as being vulgar, because it was really a single act in his view, as compared to the blood spilled on a mass scale by some of these greats that he is thinking of, which is actually kind of scary if you think about it, that he's not thinking of the positive things that these greats may have accomplished, but his focus is the fact that they transgress social norms in the context of war, spilling blood, executions, whatever. It's not necessarily specified. So he's horrified to conclude that he may in fact not be a Superman. He may be one of these awful trembling creatures, trembling beasts that he previously criticized, the cattle, the majority of the population that requires a strict moral code. He may be one of them, one of the commoners. So it appears that his confession to the police is not so much motivated by the proverbial pangs of conscience, but rather a certain disgust with oneself, a realization that he's unable to prove to himself, at least at that stage, that he is in fact a Superman. So this chasm between grandiosity and self-loathing is also reminiscent of the split between the false and the true self in a narcissistic personality. In it, the grandiose false self is constantly in need of being validated through one's own qualifiable acts, but also feedback coming from the outside, inflated positive perceptions of others. And it's necessary for this to be constant in order to maintain the false self. In contrast, the true self is full of self-hatred, feelings of inferiority, insignificance, primitive envy, rage, etc., etc. So all these kind of negative feelings compressed into this one hateful little ball of that the false self would symbolize. So it's hard not to think of the split when you look at what goes on inside Raskolnikov, although in the case of the novel, it seems to be more of a temporal development as a result of this one major focal point, the murder of the pawnbroker. His narcissistic traits also appear in his interpersonal relationships, what little relationships he had in this novel. So let's have a brief look at his relationship with Sonia. She is the daughter of the aforementioned Semyon Marmeladov, who was crushed to death in the street. The latter was a state employee, and his alcohol abuse drove essentially a teenager, Sonia was 18 in the novel, into a profession of ill repute. She is presented as a kind of an angelic creature. She's very pale, thin, blue-eyed, fair-haired. Character-wise, she's very loyal, humane, empathetic, loving. She's kind of a self-sacrificial female archetype in this novel. First, she sacrifices herself by selling her body to feed her family of origin because her father is an alcoholic and he's not providing for the family. He's wasting all the family money. Then she voluntarily follows Raskolnikov to Siberia, where he is to serve his prison sentence like a loyal Decembrist wife, but she's not his wife, so she doesn't have to do this. Yet Raskolnikov, quote, tortured her with his contempt and rudeness. He, quote, constantly tormented her in her heart, end quote. In other words, Sonia is almost the only one in this whole novel, able to communicate with him at one point. Yet, the better, more humanely, more lovingly she treats him, the worse he treats her. Raskolnikov is actually cognizant of his emotional abuse of this angelic-like creature who's putting up with it. At the end of the novel, he plans to, quote, redeem all her suffering with his infinite love, which to me sounds very grandiose on its own. This dynamic is reminiscent of what I'd call the Beauty and the Beast complex, the belief that if only you were to invest enough of yourself in a cold, hostile person, if only you were to love this person enough, whatever enough means, his or her heart would eventually melt, revealing an emotionally mature, humane, empathetic, loving individual. Perhaps, in exceptional cases, this may be true, but more often than not, this belief leads to a very, very toxic dynamic that in some cases ends tragically. So this is something that Sam Vaknin called malignant optimism, and it's very important to note. It almost seems like Sonia subscribes to a malignant optimism. She's probably motivated by her religious beliefs, not just her humanity and her almost natural empathy, but she's definitely under the spell of what I would consider a generally false belief in most cases. So in his novel, Raskolnikov indeed undergoes an exceptional transformation. It's not very common for this to happen. He's redeemed and transformed as he picks up the Bible in Siberia and eventually begins to take it seriously. Sonia's love plays no small part in this transformation as well. So this is where, in my opinion, the author's powerful religious conviction as a serious Orthodox Christian comes into conflict with his judgment as a pretty accurate literary psychologist. Dostoyevsky overrides a carefully constructed pathological traits on the part of his main protagonist with what could be described as a miracle. These traits are grandiosity, entitlement, callousness, lack of empathy, contempt, envy, poor or failed or non-existent interpersonal relationships, and of course, most important, anti-social, serious criminal acts, the worst criminal act of all, murder. Of course, we are analyzing a fictional character. If he were a real person, these traits may not amount to a full-blown personality disorder like NPD or ASPD, but they are significant enough to result in interpersonal carnage on the one hand, and of course, as I've said, the most serious crime of all, a brutal murder of an old woman. And all of that is overridden with a miracle. Now, this is not to say that profound change could not occur as a result of a traumatic event, some kind of spiritual religious enlightenment. Anything's possible, but it's especially uncommon in someone who appears to be as far on the spectrum as Raskolnikov, which perhaps is the point of the novel. So I would love to know what you guys think. Do you think it's possible for someone who has such a twisted philosophy, such a grandiose view of self that doesn't seem to be backed up by real life events? Is it possible for someone to be transformed in such a significant way? I'd love to see what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.